Julia Margaret Cameron was given a camera as a gift at the age of 48, and she became one of the most prominent portrait photographers in the Victorian era. Cameron is arguably the most important female portrait photographer of the British Victorian era. She instituted a dreamy, soft focused style which earned her criticism by her contemporaries. However, Cameron's enthusiasm for photography, which she began only in earnest when she was 48 years old, her unabashed zeal for life itself, and her unique vision enabled her to ignore the naysayers. Cameron photographed many of the most important figures in Victorian Britain and traveled in elite artistic and cultural circles her entire life. Cameron used the wet plate collodion method to make her negatives on transparent glass and made her prints using the albumen method. Recently, Cameron's work has been rediscovered and reevaluated in very positive ways. The fact that she was an independent woman in Victorian society and that she created her own studio and darkroom space is celebrated today. Art historian Carol Mabor wrote in 1995, Cameron was a performer. She was a highly visible eccentric who wore red velvet in the summer and stirred cups of tea while walking to the train station. She smelled not of delicate flowers, but of photographic chemicals. In this presentation, I will introduce you to this remarkable Victorian woman photographer who blew past stereotypes to make over 3,000 photographs over a period of just 11 years. Biography of Julia Margaret Cameron. Her maiden name was Paddle. She lived from 1815 to 1879. Cameron was born in Calcutta, where she traveled among the British colonialist cultural Anglo-Indian elite. In 1835, she traveled to a seaside resort that was said to have curative elements, and there she met a person who would quite literally transform her life, Sir John Herschel. Like other photographers of her time, Herschel would become her lifelong friend and eventually one of her most esteemed models. Cameron also met her future husband while convalescing, Charles Hay Cameron. The two married in 1838. They had 5 children of their own, adopted 5 orphans, and adopted a young Irish girl, Mary Ryan. Ryan would later serve as Cameron's most common model. Note that the Camerons named their oldest son, Henry Herschel Hay Cameron, after their friend John Herschel. As British nationals, the Camerons later moved to London in 1845. Charles, her husband, had been employed by the East India Company, which came under fire by the Indian people for being a linchpin for British imperialism and colonialism. After an uprising in early 1840, the Camerons came under financial distress, and with friends loaning them money, they left for London. Cameron immediately became involved in the artistic and literary scene in London, often joining her sister in salons. Dreams of a Dreamer. Along with over 3,000 portrait photographs of literary and scientific figures, reproductions of allegories, myths, and Bible stories, Cameron left behind something biographers especially treasure, an autobiography of her journey as a photographer. Although it is unfinished, the manuscript is key to understanding her dreams as a photographer. Some key points from her autobiography, which was written after the Camerons moved to their home on the Isle of Wight. She turned a hen house into her portrait studio. It had large glass windows that provided unparalleled natural lighting for her portrait photography. She turned her coal house into a darkroom. She wrote, the society of hens and chickens was soon changed for that of poets, prophets, painters, and lovely maidens. But perhaps most revealing of her persistence in learning the art of photography, she wrote, I began with no knowledge of the art. I did not know where to place my dark box, how to focus my sitter. In my first picture, I effaced to my consternation by rubbing my hand over the filmy side of the glass. And then there's this. From the first moment I handled my lids with a tender ardor, it has become to me as a living thing. with voice and memory and creative vigor. Tableau vivant photographs. Julia Margaret Cameron first came to my attention when I saw her tableau vivant photographs. This genre uses photography to create allegorical scenes that mimic Renaissance old master paintings. A staunch Christian, Cameron's tableau vivant work focused on stories from the Bible, mythology, and Christian imagery from the Renaissance. She employed relatives, friends, servants, neighbors, and even tourists plucked from the street to serve as her models. Each photograph was carefully staged, and the models dressed in era specific clothing. Cameron used theatrical lighting and props to create luscious photographic narratives. Note that the woman in this photograph is Cameron's adopted ward, Mary Ryan. The British poet Alfred Lloyd Tennyson commissioned Cameron to illustrate his work, Idylls of the King. She again recruited family, friends, and servants to create a total of 245 tableau vivant photographs and chose only a few to submit to Tennyson. Because of the print technologies of the time, her photographs were turned into woodcuts for printing Tennyson's book. Cameron was reportedly so unhappy with the small size and the crudeness of the woodcuts that she later created a folio of a set of 145 photographs of her friends and family members in their full size and beauty for distribution of close friends. As her folio of the photographs for the Idols of Kings was her final project, she dedicated herself to perfectly fulfilling her own vision of Tennyson's work. The result was a lavish and extravagant series of photographs featuring Cameron's typical soft and dreamy style. She funded the project by herself. Vivian and Merlin is part of the Arthurian legend retold by Tennyson and illustrated with photographs by Cameron. Her Merlin represents, quote, the magician whose purity was the wellspring of his power, an unidentified girl playing the harlot Vivian who enchants him. Note that Merlin is staged by Cameron's husband, Henry Hay Cameron, who is 20 years older than Cameron and had the most lovely, long, flowing hair and beard. Madonna portraits. Cameron made many portraits of the Madonna, the Virgin Mary who was the mother of Jesus in Christian mythology. Most Cameron's Madonna portraits were made between 1864 and 1865. For these photographs, she usually used Mary Hillier as her model. Hillier was Cameron's parlor maid, and in addition to posing for her, she also assisted in processing the photographs. A modern day relative of Hillier, Edward Coley Burne Jones, recently wrote about Mary Hillier on a Facebook page where he is an admin. Mary was so often featured in Cameron's work that she was nicknamed the Island Madonna where she lived on the Isle of Wight. Carol Mabor, who published an engrossing scholarly book entitled Pleasures Taken, Performances of Sexuality and Loss in Victorian Photographs, queries the complexities of the relationship between Cameron and her working class modeling mage that seems to become evident in the multiple portraits of Hillier as the Virgin Mother. Carol Mabor also claims that Cameron's Madonna portraits are subversive of Victorian motherhood. Quote, even as Cameron herself was in many ways the traditional bourgeois Victorian woman. Mabor explains her reasoning. Cameron not only subverted the image of the Victorian woman through her performed life, but also subverted its representation in her Madonna pictures. Again, even if she was not consciously critiquing it. For at first glance, Cameron's photographic images of the Virgin Mary appeared to conform with the expectations of the Victorian woman. Using Christian typology, the pictures properly contained women's sexuality within a space of holy motherhood. Yet, upon closer investigation, the pictures managed to bleed through the plastered walls of confinement that encircled the period's angel in the house. The images, which are often literally blurred, move metaphorically between categories, smearing the lines between sexual and not sexual, male and female, earthly and heavenly. They move like an apparition, leaving the viewer perplexed at what has been seen. Because she is photographed, however, this altered mother appears more real than mythical. Cameron also employed Jewish iconography. And of all the fascinating details about Cameron's life as a rare female photographer during the Victorian era, none surprised me as much as the fact that she was a great aunt to the American novelist Virginia Woolf. Woolf's relationship with her great aunt was complicated. On the one hand, Woolf viewed Cameron as a role model for women who refused to keep within the narrow boxes women were confined to in the Victorian age. But, on the other hand, Woolf decried Cameron's adherence to some of the Victorian mores that Woolf herself despised. Cameron often used Jewish iconography in her allegorical portraits. Like the rest of her portrait work, she used a soft focus to create a dreamlike narrative. In this case, she used stories from the Old Testament to illustrate important moments in the mythological, historical stories of the ancient Jewish people. Portrait photography. There are several photographs that Cameron made of Sir John F.W. Herschel. They are all at the Victorian and Albert Museum, and here are two of my favorites. Charles Darwin and Mrs. Duckworth were also two persons that Cameron photographed, and again, they are at the Victoria and Albert Museum. This one is entitled Pomona. Cameron's Pomona was part of a 13-piece collection of Cameron's work that was shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2013. The museum writes, the South Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert, was the only museum to collect and exhibit Julia Margaret Cameron's photographs during her time. This is one of several studies she made of Alice Liddell, who as a child had modeled for the author and photographer Lewis Carroll and inspired his novel Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Cameron, Carroll, and Liddell moved in overlapping artistic and intellectual circles. Here, surrounded by foliage, a grown-up Alice poses as the Roman goddess of orchards and gardens. The mountain nymph, Sweet Liberty. In Cameron's mountain nymph, in Cameron's mountain nymph, Sweet Liberty, Miss Keene, an arresting model about whom we know nothing but her last name, stares directly at the camera, and by extension at us, the viewer. Her hair loose and her eyes wide open. Filling the frame, she seems to step out of the picture. The photograph takes its title from John Milton's poems L'Allegro, a celebration of life's pleasures. John Herschel wrote to Cameron about his appreciation for this photograph. That head of the mountain nymph, Sweet Liberty, is really a most astonishing piece of high relief. She is absolutely alive and thrusting out her head from the paper into the air. This is your own special style. Sappho. Mary Hillier is once again the model for this photograph. The Metropolitan Museum of Art points out that there is nothing in the photograph that seems to relate to the famous Greek poet of Lesbos, Sappho, and that Cameron had labeled another print on the same image, Adriana. The museum notes that while Cameron may have set out to embody a formal ideal, she usually named her photographs after she made them. And in this case, the portrait of Mary Hillier was entitled thusly because, quote, there was more of a market for images of the Virgin, Sappho, or Christabel than for portraits of the photographer's niece or a parlor maid from the Isle of Wight. Julia Jackson, 1867. Cameron made more than 20 portraits of her favorite niece and namesake, Julia Jackson, to whom she gave this unmounted proof print. She never portrayed Julia as a sibyl or a saint, but rather as a natural embodiment of purity, beauty, and grace. Spared the usual props and costumes, the 21-year-old sitter seems here bodiless, an ethereal spirit, afloat like an untethered soul. This poetic image depicts the woman who was the model for the beautiful Mrs. Ramsay in To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf's great novel of 1927. In 1882, Julia Jackson Stephen gave birth to Virginia, and Virginia grew up to resemble her mother and, in 1926, to co-write the first book on her great aunt's photographs. Philip Stanhope Worsley, made in 1866. On February 21st, 1866, Cameron wrote to Henry Cole, director of the South Kensington Museum, I have been for 8 weeks nursing poor Philip Worsley on his dying bed. The heart of man cannot conceive a sight more pitiful than the outward evidence of the breaking up of his whole being. Worsley died of tuberculosis at the age of 30 the following May. Cameron's portrait, made the year of his death, vividly conveys the intensity of Worsley's intellectual life and something of its tragedy. To her subject's hypnotic gravity, she adds intimations of sacrifice, engulfing the dying poet in dramatic darkness. Cameron had several critics. Victorian art scholar Carol Mabor credits art historian Helmut Gernsheim for rediscovering Cameron in the mid 20th century in his book Julia Margaret Cameron, Her Life and Photographic Work, published in 1948. Gernsheim was not kind. Echoing the sexist attitudes of the mid 20th century, he belittled much of Cameron's work on Madonnas and her tableaux vivants. Maber quotes Gershon. Gershon finds only the portraits of famous men to be worthy of true admiration, and no more than 60 deserve the designation masterpiece. Gershon uses words like affected, ludicrous, and amateurish to describe the space of those other pictures to which many of the Madonnas fall. Comparison to contemporary photographers. Francesca Woodman lived 1948-58 to 1981. American photographer whose suicide at age 27 ended what promised to be a brilliant career as a photographer whose style resembled Cameron's. Nadia Ishmael, who reviewed a 2024 retrospective of Woodman's work curated by Magdalene Kearney for the National Portrait Gallery in London, wrote this about the comparison of Cameron and Woodman's photography. At first glance, we might assume that the two artists shared nothing more than the technical medium that united them. However, Magdalene Keeney's curatorial approach demonstrates that there is an aesthetic and a conceptual affinity between them, revealed as if they were ghosts within each other's compositions, both in the theatricality of the poses and what would be considered a dissolution of boundaries between the visible and the invisible. Time separated them by a century, but dreams brought them closer, as if through a mirror. Annie Leibovitz, 1949, and she's still alive. Writing for CNN in 2015, Todd Leopold noted the comparison of Julia Margaret Cameron's portraits of eminent Victorians with work by the contemporary photographer Annie Leibovitz. In particular, both photographers specialized in portrait photography and both excelled at photographing noted figures of their era. For Cameron, some of the famous persons of her time included evolutionary theorist Charles Darwin, poet Alfred Tennyson, and John Herschel, an experimental photographer and inventor of the cyanotype process who we have studied in this class. As a staff photographer for the magazine Rolling Stone, Leibovitz photographed John Lennon with Yoko Ono, the Rolling Stones, and other famous musicians. She also photographed Queen Elizabeth II and Leibowitz's own partner, Susan Sontag, an American writer, cultural critic, and public intellectual. Note the dreamlike ambiance Leibowitz created in this photograph and how similar it is to some of Cameron's dreamy portrait photography. How Julia Margaret Cameron has inspired me. I am most inspired by how Cameron weaves narratives into her photography. Although I'm a graphic artist and not a photographer per se, the stories that she tells in a single portrait or in a single tableau vivant really speak to me. The digital pen and ink selfies below are from a series entitled Reimagining Identity. Drew these as I was recovering from COVID and cancer. Like Cameron, I tend to use allegorical references. The stitches in the drawing on the left refer to my cancer surgery. In the middle drawing, I use the metaphor of a woman, me, who longs to flee her current circumstances. Additionally, I'm inspired by Cameron's deathbed portrait of the poet Philip Stanhope Worsley. I myself did a series of deathbed portraits of my friend Andrea, who is dying of colon cancer. And again, I used metaphors to express Andrea's emotions. I drew these over a series of several weeks as Andrea repeatedly attempted to die a dignified death through medically assisted suicide after Medicaid refused to pay for further chemotherapy. I was present on the day she finally died. The aurora really was spectacular that night. I named the last one, the middle one, Andrea, the ancestors have come, as a reference to Andrea's indigenous ancestry. The third portrait is entitled She Loved Purple Best. She surrounded herself with purple guitars. She painted their bedroom purple. She wore purple. It became her color. I imagine if this was ever printed in color, that all the flowers would be purple. And you'll notice the heart on her locket at her throat is an M in a heart shape. And that is because her spouse, her wife's name was Melanie. I'm going to I'm going to print these references in a stable site there on the comments below so that you can refer to them, and all the links should be live. Thank you.